Hi, so I'm Matt Hodgkinson from Hindawi. So I'm going to give a brief history of some parts of open access and then of predatory publishing, some details on telling apart predators from legitimate journals, our experience at Hindawi, the impact that predatory publishing has on other legitimate publishers like us, the wider scamming ecosystem, and then a look at some other business models and publishing models. So on the timeline, goes back roughly 20 years. So the origins of OA go back to about the late 90s. There were kind of free journals online, but the coalescence of the open access movement was about 20 years ago. And around the same time, COPE was founded as well. So there was BMC, where I started my career in 2003. There was PLOS, which was initially a petition and then became a publisher. And so around the mid-2000s, then open access was quite well established. PLOS 1 was launched in 2006, and I started there in 2010. Hindawi, where I am now, flipped from, it began as a subscription publisher and flipped in 2007. And then shortly after that, it was around 2008, then people started to see these bad actors. Gunter Eisenbach at the JMIR called them black sheep, and they did things like at BMC we saw that Bentham Open copied one of our posters. Bentham also published some 9/11 conspiracy theorist papers. And as a reaction to some of this, then there was a group called OASPA, the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association, was founded, including by Hindawi. And then also Geoffrey Beale began writing about this, first of all in an article in the Charlton Advisor, and then he formed his famous list. So there was a proliferation afterwards. There was countermeasures to that, Think, Chat, Submit, which was mentioned earlier, and the principles of transparency and best practice in scholarly publishing, which came from COPE and the Directory of Open Access Journals and from WAMI. And then moving more to the present day, Beale's list is gone. It was very controversial and it was quite confusing what the reasons were, why it was gone. As was mentioned earlier as well, the Federal Trade Commission successfully sued Omics, the biggest, most well-known predator. Cabels have launched their own whitelist and now blacklist as well, although this is subscription, so it's not in wide use. And then in April, there was a summit in Ottawa, which I was pleased to attend by David Mower's group, and that was to try to come up with a definition, try to come to consensus on a name, we didn't, and try to come up with possible solutions. So there'll be things coming out of that summit. So telling apart legitimate publishers, one of the key things is clear information on costs. So many open access publishers use what's called the article publishing processing charge. That was initially come up with by BMC in around 2001. It's worked to flip the model so it scales well with funding, but there's issues that it then implies that you'll publish anything just to get the money, and so publishers have waiver policies. So, for example, low-income, small economy countries, authors from there will get automatic waivers in many publishers so that they don't need to worry about trying to get the money. Separation of the ownership and finances from editorial decisions and the editorial team is key, and publishers need to engage with the wider community. So joining COPE, joining OASPA, signing up to the principles of transparency, and that transparency means about who owns you, who runs you, where you're based, and how you run. And these things are often lacking in predatory publishers. One of the important things about COPE and OASPA membership is they are policed. I know that COPE, in the last couple of years, was seriously thinking about removing a member because they weren't following the process correctly. Equally, OASPA, I know that they've removed members because twice in the past few years I've reported issues with members and they have been removed. You also look at legitimate indexing services such as Web of Science, that's the SCI, and the new wider ESCI, and also Scopus and Medline. And another thing is that you want to watch for people who are over-promising, so a few days for publication, and then people who respond to criticism rather than accepting valid criticism, you fight and you threaten critics. So Omics famously threatened Jeffrey Beall with a $1 billion lawsuit. Well, that came back to bite them. So our experience, so it was just over 20 years ago. We're founded in Cairo. So went through a period of acquiring journals and building them up, and then our current CEO, Paul Peters, was tasked with looking at the new open access because of the success of BMC and PLOS, and we flipped our entire portfolio in 2007. So there was a growth in the journals and submissions, experiments with different peer review models. We had a data journal, for example, and there was one called the International Scholarly Research Network, which was the idea was have a reviewing board where 3 of them would review each paper, and the names would all be on each paper. We co-founded OASPA in 2008, but then when Beall started his list, he put us on the watch list, and he put ISRN on because he didn't like the word network being in the title of a journal. He thought it was a misnomer. And so the problem with the way that he approached it was sometimes his criteria were not very well defined, and he might make precipitous decisions. And he even admitted that listing ISRN really was damaging to his credibility at the time. So ISRN was removed, the watch list vanished, and we hit another bump when we acquired the Scientific World Journal in 2010. It was promptly the next year deselected from Thomson Reuters, the ones who run the impact factor. It was prior issues with a citation ring that we hadn't known about. So there was a ring with 2 other journals published by other publishers, and so we had to retract a couple of papers, and it prompted us to look at better editorial screening. So we now actively check for citation manipulation. We try to verify author identities, look at text similarity, and a whole host of other things. Then we also realized that we needed to focus on research integrity, so the team was formed about 3.5 years ago. I joined 3 years ago. And then we've also moved our HQ to London as well, where we can recruit more publishing expertise to keep improving our processes. And we've had partnerships with other publishers for a few years with Sage. We've now got a publishing partnership with Wiley and one to do the new partners journals with AAAS. So we get affected by publishers. Open access gets tarred with the same brush, and there's very strong doubt about new entrants, which really harms some kind of experimentation in peer review and in publishing. We get stolen and imitated journal titles. We've had this in the last few months. We've had to make legal threats to 2 publishers who've been using our name, one who created a journal with exactly the same name, and there was definite confusion from authors about this, so we had to contact all of their previous authors and editors to warn them, and we actually had to engage in a lawyer in the US to force them to change the title. And there was another one who was using our journal title in their calls for papers, using our calls for papers wording to basically trick people into submitting to what doesn't even seem to be a publisher at all. It seems to just be a website to harvest papers and money. Dual submission can be a problem where if the gazumping, a term from the housing market, where you put in an offer but somebody comes in, sneaks a lower offer in, and you lose that house. With dual submission that works where they submit to us and we do proper peer review, and this may take weeks or months, and they submit to Predator and they are out in a matter of days, and then we notice later on when we reach the point of acceptance, oh, it's already out there. So it causes a lot of time and effort waste, and the risk of dual publication is particularly high because of their bad practices, especially because they refuse to withdraw when people realize what they're facing. And they generally degrade the standards. There's people who work with them then have lower expectations of what peer review really looks like, and they've got unrealistic expectations of how quick things can go. So they're part of a wider ecosystem of scamming. It's a term that I use called it's cargo cults. It comes from Richard Feynman, a physicist in the 1970s. He spoke about the idea that in the Pacific Islands in World War II, the Americans came in and suddenly there was all these airfields, and there was cargo coming in, so goods. And when they left at the end of World War II, then that went away. And so the people there tried to replicate this, so they would create control towers. and try to direct the aircraft in. Of course, they weren't doing the real, they were going through the motions. And so the analogy is that predatory journals and lots of these other organizations go through the motions so that they, on the surface, resemble proper practice, but really the fundamentals are missing. So a publisher called Lambert Academic, they're also known as VDM, they spam people to say, hey, you published a thesis, we'll publish it as a book. They slap stock art on the cover, they stick it on Amazon, and then unsuspecting people buy it for £100 and they realize that they've just got something that they've been scammed. There's problems with paper mills, authorship for sale, and fake peer review. This news piece in Science from 2013 really first exposed the scale of this, and this is also an issue in India and Iran particularly. And there's the predatory conferences, scamferences, as well as a real issue. And this happens because of perverse incentives. Oh no, there was also a fake COPE even. So there was a COPE in India that had set up, and so we and some other publishers and COPE sent them legal warnings because they'd listed some of our journals on there, and so that got taken down. So that was very short-lived, only about a month. But it shows that the whole infrastructure can be kind of cloned and faked. Why is it happening? Perverse incentives. So one of the real things we can do is sign up for DORA, sfdora.org, and apply DORA. So that's what we've done at Hindawi. We've really de-emphasized impact factors and looked at other ways that we can look at alternative metrics. And there's really a lack of training and support for researchers. So people are often doing this because they are under pressure and then they don't know better and they don't have proper mentoring. Something I do is volunteer for Author Aid, run by INASPA, to help mentor developing country authors. So the subscription model isn't immune to these issues. So the predatory journals did come out of, they spotted one kind of way to abuse the APC, but some hijacked or fake journals present as subscription journals. And you often can't tell because then the content is supposedly behind a paywall. So if you're not a subscriber already, you can't tell. And so some journals that are presenting as subscription journals are in fact just total scams. There's also author fees in subscription journals that many people don't know about. My former colleague Anna Sharman had a blog post about this, so there's colour charges, etc. And those can also create a risk of bad practice. And sometimes subscription costs are justified by the number of journals or the number of articles, and that creates exactly the same pressure to publish as much as possible, as is said about open access. The biggest bulk retraction ever wasn't from open access journals, it was from IEEE in 2014, where they realized that many of the conferences they published in 2011 in China were basically totally no standards, things greatly out of scope, and they bulk retracted several thousand articles at once. There was a subscription journal that was created by the pharmaceutical company Merck. It was simply just a marketing tool. It wasn't a real journal at all. And that came out in 2011 that they'd done this. There's a journal called Medical Hypotheses that wasn't peer-reviewed. It's openly not peer-reviewed, so it's editorially selected, deliberately publishing provocative work until they got too close to the sun, and they published an HIV/AIDS denial paper, and the publisher pulled the plug on the editor and forced peer review in. And a couple of delightful papers in an apparently reputable subscription journal. Is it ethical to heal a young white elephant of his physiological autism? It makes as much sense as the title does. And whether the cause of the Cambrian explosion was terrestrial or cosmic, including octopuses coming from space. So, preprint servers. So, yeah, Susan wanted to look at alternative models. So, they've got low or no fees. So, there's much less risk of scamming going on there. There's no guarantee of peer review, that kind of being the point of preprint servers, because if you introduce peer review, then they're a journal. Archive doesn't have any comments, bioRxiv does, so there's different approaches, and the level of editorial screening before you post something up varies. So medRxiv has to have higher because of the risks of damage to health. Archive does have some screening to keep out crank physics, and so as a reaction to that, the VIXRA was created, which doesn't have those kind of standards, and it's been said by a famous physicist that essentially most things in there are likely to not likely to contain acceptable results. So there's also the idea of free to read, free to publish. I think it's sometimes called platinum publishing, whereas gold OA is APCs and green OA is where you do self-archiving or publishing like in PubMed Central. So one of the big ones is Cielo, which was founded in Brazil, so it's often in English and Portuguese, and that's been very successful for those local journals. B.L. unfairly called it a favela, so his distaste for open access wasn't just the APC model and predators, but it was wider. There's the Open Library of the Humanities, which has support from a consortium of libraries to fund it instead of an APC. You can do crowdfunding like Knowledge Unlatched do. So previously, subscription textbooks, people will put up money and then pay that to the publisher to basically say, you know, from now on, you can make that free under an open license. And there's volunteerism, so you can run journals on open source platforms like the OJS. But there's often hidden costs like university staff costs, infrastructure costs, and the questions are how sustainable are they? How can you scale it? Often you start off with a small group and then you realize you need to hire people in and you become a publisher. And there's a possibility of funder influence. So some funders and governments may be very benign, but other funders and governments may have particular agendas, and that might influence either directly or through self-censorship what things you feel you can do as a publisher. And there's different types of peer review, so we're normally used to double-blind review and single-blind review. People are looking at open peer review, so there's all sorts of different flavors of this. Some of it is about the authors knowing who the reviewers are, some of it is about the readers knowing who the reviewers are, and some of it is about the content of the reviews being published. So you can have different permutations of that. So a publisher called Science Domain International uses open peer review, so anyone can see who reviewed it and what the reviews were, but they published a SciGen paper. So this is a software tool that can create what looks like a scientific article, but it's not. And German journalists stung them, submitted a SciGen paper, so you can read the reviews and see, but it's total nonsense. So it's not a panacea. You can have post-publication peer review, so there are different ways of doing this. F1000 Research is one of the platforms that does this, and their platform is also author-driven rather than editor-driven. So at Hindawi, we never allow author-suggested reviewers because there's several studies that show that they're more lenient than editor-suggested reviewers, but it also means that the time is quicker, and you can sometimes get debates between the reviewers as well. And there's the idea of volunteer peer review as well. So some journals do it so that maybe as a supplement, you can post the abstract up and then people can volunteer to be a reviewer as well as the editors selecting reviewers. And I know that PAJ does that, for example. So that's just a quick run through some of the different alternatives. So that's everything from me. You can see a link to the poster that I presented on Monday there. Goes to my tweet about it. That's my blog, which I haven't written about that much, but there's some other posts that I've written about predatory publishing going back to 2007, and there was a post that I posted on the Hindawi blog going more into the idea of cargo cults. Thanks very much.
Surprised if there weren't some questions, so unless you're all exhausted, please go up to the mic.
Hello, my name is Alexander Panchin. I'm from Russia, and in Russia we have a lot of predatory journals. There's actually a whole enterprise, an industry of that, and some of those journals manage to get themselves into indexes, citation indexes such as Scopus. So do you have any suggestions of how do we kick them out?
So Scopus does have like an editorial process. So independent academics do assess journals for inclusion and then also exclusion. So they do actively review them. So for example, Omics and SERP and I think WASET were previously included in Scopus. And so what happens sometimes is they acquire what was previously a legitimate journal from another publisher. Pulsus Group was one that that Omics acquired. And so then, great, they have a Scopus index and suddenly the submissions flood in, and so there's a lag before people realize that things have changed. But they do have processes, and you can see what journals they've deselected. So I would say to contact Scopus directly, and then also use social media and write blog posts to increase the pressure. But Scopus definitely will remove bad actors.
Thank you very much for a very instructive lecture. Now, from my own little experience as editor from a journal years ago, I'm asking you if you see a correlation between the demands that the journal is putting upon an author to do him or herself what used to be editorial work, including typesetting and everything, versus, no, we will do everything for you, you just send in the file and we will send you a preprint or a proof, and then you can make corrections and so on. Because my experience was, I was somewhere in the middle with my journal, that some authors got suspicious. They said, they are doing too much for us. Any ideas there? Is there a trend? And can you use that to discriminate between decent journals and those who might be on the darker side?
I think that's really difficult. I think there has been a tendency to try and outsource things from publishing processes. But it would be difficult to say that the more you outsource to other people, the better you are. I mean, at Hindawi, you can send it in whatever format you like. I mean, a crayon on the back of a cornflake packet is going too far, but you can have your references in whatever format, so we don't mind because we'll sort all of that out at the point of publication. So, and that's just good customer service rather than not being discriminatory, because those things don't matter as much if we're going to be rejecting 80% of what's submitted to us. What's the point of making authors jump all through all these hoops? I think there might be criteria, but I don't know if it's been studied. So yeah, I'd have to kind of take a pass mainly on that, I think.
Okay, so it might be a topic for an MA thesis or something.
Yeah. So there's probably a PhD thesis in there.
This is a good place to suggest that, Ryan. From Brazil.
Yes, Olavo Amaral from Brazil. Thank you for the comments on Cielo. I do agree that it's a system that has worked well in the country for a lot of purposes. That said, I do agree with the point that there might be funder conflicts of interest in terms of if you're a bad country, you might restrict some people from expressing some ideas. In that sense, though, I mean, isn't the right way to go to actually try to distribute funders? I mean, I guess that's the model behind the archive originally, it's supported by a few libraries. I mean, if we can get the structure of distributing the different funders between the people interested in science, couldn't that work as a model for platinum journals?
Yeah, I think, and as well, for all publishers can look at diversifying the source of revenue. So, I mean, at Hindawi, for instance, we're doing the partnerships with other journals, and so you look at other services, and then it reduces your reliance on that one source of revenue. And diversifying funders, I think, is absolutely a way that you can reduce the risk that you're going to be at the whim of the funder, either because maybe there's a change in government, or somebody new comes into the top of the funder and doesn't like that. Doesn't value that publication anymore. So yeah, diversification is a good way to avoid conflict.
Mohammed Husseini from Dublin City University. I was wondering what you think about contributor role ontologies and taxonomies for contribution like credit, and how they can be incorporated into your workflow, and what can be achieved by incorporating them.
We're looking at it. Yeah, it's something that's kind of on the roadmap of kind of open science things to include. So credit is it's a taxonomy of contributor roles, so it's a supplement to the idea of authorship. So you can put down that you that you got the money, that you collected the data, that you wrote the article. So it's that kind of thing. So it's a structured way that people can say what they did. And so this goes beyond the traditional idea of authorship, so that anyone who contributed in any way can be either an author and have those things very clear, or they can be acknowledged and have it very clear as well. Yeah, so this is something that we're actively looking at, but I'm not sure how it ties into predatory journals, but can you get the angle on that one?
We can discuss later.
Okay.
Andrew Gray from Auckland. It's pretty clear from all the discussions that we really have little knowledge of how best to prosecute the process of publishing. So my question is, are the publishers, you or your colleagues, interested in or going to conduct research in this area to try and answer some of these questions? You could randomise some of these things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There have been randomised trials. So there's the peer review congress happens every 4 years. I think the next one is in 2 years' time. Happens in Chicago. So it's very much came out of the medical publishing community. And so there are, every 4 years there are published like abstracts and then papers coming out of that, and there's an increasing focus on doing RCT randomized trials. One was done at +1 when I was there to look at the effect of the ARRIVE reporting guidelines for animal reporting. And it was disappointing. There wasn't much effect of it, but it was quite instructive it was quite difficult to run, and it was slightly artificial because that meant then the staff couldn't really enforce it in the way. So it was, I suppose, merely if you just tell the authors to fill out a checklist, it doesn't have much effect. So you've got to go above and beyond that, was the answer to that. So yeah, that publishers are doing some of these trials, but it's sometimes not trivial to incorporate it into submission systems.
I think we have time for a last question. Go ahead.
Paul Delegato, Conference on University Presidents in France. What do you think about open review, when the name of the review, open peer review, and also all the Copernicus model, where you have both anonymous review before publication, and then readers can contribute also reviewing after the paper has been published for a month or so?
So my view on open peer review, I used to... I worked on the BMC series at Biomed Central, so the medical journals have had that since they launched. I found that it did cause some problems with getting people to agree. It was harder. It's harder in clinical medicine anyway than in biology. But some people were reluctant to go with it, so a lot of the efforts now are to have it as a choice, so a choice for the reviewer, a choice for the authors. I also found sometimes reviewers had great difficulty expressing what they wanted with their name on, and I had to sometimes work with them to craft how to say what they wanted to say in a way that wasn't going to come across as maybe offensive or inflammatory, which I suppose is instructive at how some academics can't actually say what they want to say without being polite. So it's not straightforward, but I think it can be very helpful, and it can be quite educational for people to see how peer review works. But I don't think it's a magic solution. So some people think that all you have to do is open peer review and suddenly everything's transparent and all the problems are solved. And really, it's whatever model you take, there's going to be pros and cons.
Well, I hope you'll all join me in thanking our 3 panelists for an interesting discussion today.